Hello everyone, today we make another video commentary on scholagladiatoria's work, specifically his last video, How Did Medieval Soldiers Survive the Longbow Arrow Storm? In the last months I made other commentaries on scholagladiatoria's videos. I reiterate the esteem that I always had from several years or more at this point for Matt Histon, his work, the fact that he single-handedly founded what he, even as a term, historical European martial arts. He runs a very successful, famous, and really great channel on essentially mostly medieval, but also ancient, modern, contemporary arms and armor. I do not think that you need any presentation about him, but it's just for saying that I've never taken an antagonistic stance against him. I think that his work is good, and this is a bit, we'll talk about it in other videos, my personal experience with HEMA. You would say it's completely unrelated, but also with reenactment, there is some context, given that, as you know, also Easton's channel, as we'll see today as well, is very much about context first and foremost. Brings me to see, mostly as someone who reconstructs tactics, battles, specifically, not only as a medievalist myself, a particular lens, perspective, bias, if you want. We all have one regarding, in fact, this very field: tactics, combined arms, battles, formations, how medieval warfare was waged in a properly art of war sense, right? And in my past videos, I already sort of profiled this clear impression that I have that while, of course, Matt Easton largely focuses on apology, he sometimes tends to simply take a leap forward and say, okay, so tactics more or less tended to work like that. And it's not like he makes particular mistakes or anything. I'm not here, again, to discredit at all scholagladiatoria. Please go, this channel, subscribe and follow and so on. I wish I had more time to watch his videos, but I normally don't watch YouTube videos to begin with. I still understand how there are people follow me, as a matter of fact, knowing my own work as well, because it's long and boring, I understand it. But I think that these are the good chances to discuss the medieval art of war, which otherwise we would not really have on another platform, right? I'm really not too much after the views. Yes, it can be that whenever I make these videos, I make more views, but in general, I also feel somehow thankful for Easton's graceful decision, if he ever, acknowledged me, as not to answer me, because that's also a lot of, back and forth that, may distract me in particular. I don't know, Easton. In any case, in order to get a gist of what I'm talking about, you can check my former video commentaries on scholagladiatoria out, as well as my general content, especially about tactics of battles, reconstruction, and so on. So it's useless for me to digress on what, in any case, it's going to unfold simply by reading, as usual, the script, and or at least skipping some aspects that are not really here particularly interesting. So how did medieval soldiers survive the longbow arrow storm? So to make the long story short, because there is a premise that has relatively not much to do with the wall, and most of the things I would like to comment on are in a relatively narrower part of the video than usual. Like some other videos had been dedicated in a more meaty way, as Easton himself says, to sort of the wall topic. Here it's a bit more scattered, and there are just a few things, as usual, that I disagree with, but that I think are important to point out for a debate. So this video was made after another famous channel making replicas, testing regarding, in fact, longbow performance against armored targets and so on is concerned. So I will skip here the intro about that, because it's relatively not so interesting to me, at least. And I've been critical, actually, of that other channel, because I don't believe that replica testing is that interesting, or at least it can be. Surely there is a lot of also positive application. You can understand lots of stuff. But say, if we are as we are, unfortunately, through YouTube, but as a culture, because generally speaking, these things end up on YouTube anyway. pretending that all what we can add with a level of sophistication about our understanding of the medieval art of war is through replica testing, we are scholarly alienated from any trace of actual historical knowledge concerning medieval armies, because there is an overwhelming, to say the least, amount of evidence regarding how armies fought on the field, and making these testing about things that not even medieval authors consider relevant or important to get what, like how a battle was won. That's not how you can even minimally reconstruct how the thing happened. Not even saying, but you can multiply this FX by X number of soldiers. Literally, our understanding of medieval warfare is something a bit more complex, deeper, and that just by the few indicators that we have, completely neglect any technologistic approach to the matter. And there is also a even deeper theoretical understanding of the art of war in a Clausewitzian lens that, derives also simply from the experience garnered through years and years of campaigns and battle reconstruction, that simply tells us that whatever the point is, like, medieval armies were largely homogeneous. And in fact, great part of the bias that I pointed out from these communities that I unfortunately had the sort of the accident, I'll say, of personally approach, even so from the distance, but already at that point resenting enormously the fallout, what emanated from there, because I believe that they're completely askewed and do not really have much of a heuristic value in any applicable field of military historical studies to any expandably relevant level. So Easton says something in this video. We're going to look at how, this is the point we enter in the context, the common, this is important to stress because eventually the video changes focus a little bit, but it doesn't matter, it still remains coherent. The common medieval infantrymen and what they can do, I'm reading, somewhat to mitigate the fact that they might have hundreds of arrows being shot at them. This is the script from the YouTube video, all right? So this is, in general, the question. And already the question in itself, again, there isn't so much that I sort of see as blatantly wrong in this video, as we'll see now. But for this very reason, I will perhaps be a bit pickier and give a bit some instruction setting concerning the context in itself, right? So here, it's mostly a matter of perspective. What's the perspective here? What can, first of all, this common medieval infantryman, so you pick an abstract common medieval infantryman and you sort of individualize something like, how could avoid, being sort of, how he could succeed, let's put it in the opposite sense, in emerging alive from an engagement where these hundreds of arrows were shot at him. Really, in Eastern words here, what can they do when you're going to be facing mass archery shooting from longbows, hitting you, wounding you potentially? What can you possibly do? All right. The perspective is already individualized to the extent that here we're not talking tactics. That's the first thing I notice with a beginning like this, meaning that yes, we're going to talk tactics, but it's all going to be reduced mostly to either an individual level and or the collective dimension, the combined arms, one formation, whatever, is basically not quite discussed in sort of any relevant sense by which these weapons were actually used en masse. All right, there are all kind of engagements in warfare, naturally. I may be biased in favor of sort of the bigger battle that in any case is the preferential source of historiographical information regarding how even weapons were used, because I reiterated, medieval authors describing battles did not care about weapons, largely. And even when they pointed something out in that sense, that is relevant and surely exceptional, and that shows, of course, how important weapons were. There is a sea of other information that nobody conveniently, I would say, deems to go look at. This is not a veiled criticism to Easton at all. I'm talking literally the bias that I see even in the allegedly top sort of military history journals, towards essentially this still technologistic idiocy that battles are won or lost because of this weapon or that other, without properly understanding not just the Clausewitzian concept of struggle between moral forces that mutually influence one another during combat, and so something that is not decided at the beginning because of weapons or another, and that already in fact would dump down as a concept the entire understanding of warfare that otherwise is very well known to the experts. But it's rather literally like we know sometimes how these tactics worked, and for some reason we do not take the approach of looking at that, but we focus on the individual soldier and how this or that move or equipment or position of the individual guy in the formation, not the formation of how he was employed or whatever, is going to alleviate losses, in this case, trying to avoid them. Which, by the way, if you're going to combat, first of all, you know that you're going to kill and get killed. But more importantly, and this is yet the other bias that unfortunately comes mostly from a sort of Anglo-derived perspective, that this longbow or missile weapons in general, as a consequence, would have been the massive game changer or whatever. These were notoriously secondary arms, all right? The single and most important clash happened in melee, in hand-to-hand combat, right? In cavalry charges, in the heavy infantry withstanding, if we stick to the 100 Years' War, and also we sort of simplify this notion that, by the way, the English armies would have been radically different from the other ones. No, they used basically the same type of tactics in the sense of exceptionalism, especially tied to the longbow at Similia, is completely oblivious of the fact that practically the same type of tactics were used conceptually in combined arms and properly battle formations in the entire Western Europe, and for sort of very precise political, military, and social fundamentals. But back to Easton, he says that the most important takeaways from watching arrows versus armor. Here I'm reading the script, so there is something that wasn't understood by YouTube in any case, like the sense is clear. In fact, arrows versus armor 1 and 2, okay, this was talking about testing. In general, he was showing footage of the previous video and was observing, and here, something I agree totally with, and that is actually very good for Easton to say, that is the fact that armor penetration notoriously wasn't much of a priority for these kind of missile weapons in general, or better, right? Here we could digress once again in a powerful way, explaining what Easton himself points out, that yes, crossbow bolts were often reinforced to pierce armor in particular, and that was the highest performance that it was supposed to achieve. A bit like the same swords, actually, if you look at especially up until the spread of plate armor. Now, the sword mostly increases, mostly for cutting, right, to become ever sharper. Then plate armor comes around, and then at some point that increasing competition for the sharpest sword suddenly changes, and swords increase in size and whatever, showing that at least as far as mail was concerned, the idea is that a sword of those previous centuries was mostly conceived to destroy mail, destroying itself in the process, right? So, and obviously most blows would have not actually destroyed either of them, and so that's the same thing that here Easton says transposed for bodkins, for armor-piercing missile. And he says also down the line, we will see it now, the fact that presuming to test longbow in that sense, just in terms of how much armor penetrated, does not matter, because in actual context, in actual fact of the battle, that number of bolts, let's be abstracts about crossbows, other weapons, that would actually pierce armor were irrelevant in the bigger picture, right, in the economy of physical damage inflicted in a battle of the time, which I totally subscribe to. And it is actually this is where you perfectly agree with Easton, and you understand that he gets the thing, and we've seen the paradox also in the previous videos. He actually knows things, but in his videos he likes to talk, to entwine things, and sometimes it's not like he contradicts himself, but he sometimes pushes from that side and sometimes from the other, and what you would be interested in, it's the definitive aspect, and or at least but according to context, something in between that we can say in a more theoretically fixed fashion, right? And he says, again, it shows that footage that in which they were essentially replicating lots of arrows shot at late medieval armor, right? And he talks here about the same level of penetrativity and etc. So he points out that gaps are more important than the armor penetration. And so from here, he goes on saying that there were ways to avoid exposing gaps, and he passes from the sense the armor in a sort of abstractly structural sense to how those who wore it were deployed in the formation. So let's completely skip this initial part of the video that talks about the footage. It has nothing to do. And he says the real purpose of this video is to ask how could a common soldier wearing equipment like we saw in this previous testing, how could they mitigate and minimize the risk going onto a battlefield where they knew there were going to be lots of enemy longbows in particular. And so the attention is in general to the longbow. Even there, how much like an average soldier in Western Europe had to worry about coping with longbows as opposed to crossbows. At some point in the video it says, but because the crossbow had a lower rate, doesn't really matter much, right? It's not like, especially in an individual sense, you're trying to escape that. And also, we don't really have much of a comparative evidence of how, crossbowmen as large bodies of troops engaged in combat against longbowmen were particularly bad, because most of the times that happened, and were actually crossbowmen's defeats, there were very heavy imbalances, starting from numbers. Crecy is the best example of that. As a matter of fact, also the more famous in general because of the outcome, where you realize that the Genoese crossbowmen literally were at enormous disadvantage way before beginning. In any case, he says, well, we'll dive into that very important context section. So we have to set the context before we try and answer the question. Okay, let's set this context first. Okay, so the first thing to point out is that we figured that we see in arrows versus armor as a brigandine over mail. All right, so he's talking about that as well, but it's still fitting a full shirt as well as plate on the arms, very good sallet and a ear, etc. And that's actually pretty good armor, right? That is well-equipped professional level. In other words, a private retinue, privately equipped soldier of the 15th century. And yes, because in the replica testing, that was essentially the point, like looking at some, upper middle soldiers, put in these terms, during the century and area of Europe, by the way, of highest armoredness in absolute terms, if you pick Western Europe as a whole. And I have, in fact, something a bit more to add later concerning this. It says, in fact, if you look even in England, where the armor levels are fairly high, actually, compared to some places in Europe, if you look across Europe as a whole, we very often see infantry wear significantly less armor than that. All right. So he actually acknowledges here that, yes, mostly in the West, those types of soldiers were fairly common. Later, he says something like, this is not quite the case. He says, for example, we know in Switzerland this time it was very common for infantry carrying pikes or halberds to have nothing but a helmet. Yes, notoriously, Switzerland was incredibly poor from a material point of view, and they literally had to seize Burgundian spoils of war to armor themselves in any proper way. So he says, so he seemed, at least if the script is correct, because it is correct, that the previous phrase literally said more or less, yes, this was common, but maybe not in places like Switzerland. All right, let's take this as an example without any systemic relevance. We suspect, it says strongly that the battle, so you're talking Battle of Talton in England, there were masked militia levies who probably weren't wearing much of armor. I don't know what to say mask here. I should have listened to the video. If anything, in most cases, as we find this all over Europe. So it doesn't matter whether we look in France or the various German states or Scandinavia or Spain or Italy. We often find that infantry don't have as much armor as seen in the replica testing. All right. What does that tell us? That there would have been mincemeat against most archery. But not everyone had most archery. We'll come back to this point in a minute. He reiterates the point that different parts of Europe had, again, different traditions, says Eastern Europe, the composite bow and firearms. Okay. He says, now I don't want to make any sweeping statements about saying therefore because there were lots of long bows in 100 Years' War in the Wars of the Roses, the English and the French armored up more than in other places, right? Which they didn't. Although I might make that argument in another video, but I'm going to leave that for another time. I personally don't think that that was the case, right? Telling the truth, as Schwerpunkt. I think it's a bit of a matter of type of sort of artistic representation mix. Like, yes, we have also evidence of what was actually worn in the indentures and so on, but let's say there is no evidence that actually during the 100 Years' Wars and War of the Roses, I don't know, the English, the French just in the former, of course, would be particularly more armored than other parts, especially Western Europe. Right. On the contrary, we should point out that actually northern France and England, probably while being particularly advanced military culture, there's no doubt about this, did lag slightly behind some places like, I don't know, Milanese armor area and at Similia. Right. So it's absolutely fair to say that, I don't know, maybe compared with Spain, that was the case. It really depends on also what sort of indicators you want to bring to the table. I will, in any case, wait for that video because I don't think that we have an actually comparative clue, right? Most of the evidence is relatively homogeneous, right? Just you may think that, yes, we know that certain, for example, models of armor, what I just said about, for example, Italian production was based on structural evidence of how more or less advanced, and that's mostly indicators the same Nicole used, for example, in his work, than another place, right? However, there are so many other factors for which it's very difficult objectively to compound everything by saying, this places, and especially France and England were particularly more heavily armored than other parts in Europe because of the longbow. Even apparently, again, Easton believes that. He hasn't made the point. I make my anticipation, but I'll, if anything, wait for that video. So he says, but what is interesting, this final thought on this part of the topic, that is that when a combined German force fought at the Battle of Stokefield in 1487 at the sort of end of the Wars of the Roses, look at what happened. The Germans got shot to pieces. They got shot to pieces by English and Welsh archers en masse, right? The Germans got shot to pieces. They got shot to pieces by English and Welsh archers en masse. Now, if I'm not wrong at this point, we're talking German mercenaries in the form of already Landsknechten, as they had probably modeled after the same Swiss model. And this is not really an indication of the fact that there would have been some heavier armoredness in places like England, like at the time of the Wars of the Roses, in any particular reason. It simply means that some tendentially unarmored German troops were shot to pieces by sort of English British longbows. Let's extend the thing to the region, because I don't know how they were employed, right? How they were equipped, what kind of mercenaries also they were, as a matter of fact. And we all know that in the history of the art of war, the reason why these pikemen were equipped, we've seen also in previous videos with scholagladiatoria, were less armored, is that they had surpassed that more quote-unquote medieval way of fighting due to the collective training of these forces, right? I mean, the Swiss, the poor beggar, ragamuffin Swiss that Machiavelli says, as opposed to the Landsknechten didn't even bat or something like that, were able to destroy actually the richest, the most opulently armed and equipped troops of the era, namely the armies of Charles the Bold of Burgundy, right? So it doesn't add up. We can't look at the Battle of Stokefield, that at some point we will cover in Schwerpunkt, I'm sure, and say, well, just the Germans were shot to pieces at the end of the day. There are similar episodes. At some point, the Irish were massacred by some Welsh archers in English service back in the High Middle Ages, because we know the Irish didn't have a lot of armor. But again, it's not like warfare. Ethan perfectly knows this, by the way. I'm not here for, telling him that, I don't know. I just pointed out that saying this just in a in terms of context, it's not contextual to how the art of war was evolving, right? So yes, good example that longbows did hurt a lot, especially more lightly armored troops. But let's say those same retinues of more feudal forces in Germany would have been pretty heavily armored, to say, and it's not like things change in any case. The Germans were imported there to be some more professional troops, to be employed in ways that may have not been well done, or that, yes, may have been different because they had adapted to another type of warfare, and here they paid for it in any case. But we're talking by different degrees of scale that do not invalidate, of course, like the developments in the art of war of the time, that England would actually significantly lag behind starting from this point after the 100 Years' War, all right? And especially the notion that there would have been some more armor around comparatively to other countries, especially in times where still, again, for example, firepower was not that intense, where more or less armored troops would have been just provided with this greater collective training than any individual protection. We have seen it also in other videos. So Easton says, now it makes a certain degree of sense that English and French and Flemish and to some degree Spanish soldiers were used to facing mass longbows. Okay, the YouTube transcript says masked, instead it means mass, all right, longbows. And okay, but they also, however, the rest of Europe was habituated to face, also in Western Europe, mass use of crossbows, as a matter of fact. Let's not talk about these. It's slightly different. We will partially come back with that. And in fact, Easton says that would have been true in Eastern Europe as well. Yeah, but it wasn't necessarily true in the German states or Italy, where mass longbows, aside from Sir John Hawkwood, weren't really used widely in those areas. All right. He says crossbows were predominantly used and firearms were predominantly used, which are very powerful weapons, but with a very slow rate of shooting. Yeah, but also, in that sense, more devastating capacity. So you can't take that out of the equation. So, what they didn't need, especially in the against early arquebuses or against crossbows, less armor than they did with longbows, especially because of rate of fire. There's no evidence about that. If anything, the best armor, the same English imported, together with longbows produced there, was Italy, as we explained before. So, and Easton also very well knows that. So, the English themselves imported everything from the continent at that point, because they weren't really very well equipped by the end of the 15th century. Flemish, German horses, armor, guns, and so on. So that, if anything, as a quantity, is sort of more relevant than looking at this very end of at least of the medieval age, because still the English would go on with the longbow until the mid-16th century, right? In a functional sense, by the way, it did still work, because of quantity, because of habit, because of lots of other things. But if here we have to talk about the average soldier, the common soldier, so to say, that had to cope with longbows, well, we're looking largely at sort of later medieval warfare. We're talking multiple centuries, and not just this last corner where arquebuses, also pike spears were coming around and so on. Easton says, so in a place where you might be facing thousands and thousands of arrows coming away, it would make sense to wear certain types of armor that protects you. Also, this is debatable, really. What is, especially when this amount of arrows starts arriving, that really changes in the type of protection in a strictly organizational or material way, right? Because, I don't know, if you were an Englishman and you were under French crossbow fire, you didn't need a type of armor. You simply outclassed them or pushed them. As we'll see now, the sense that the longbow was the game changer, something dramatically asymmetrical in power, capacity. First of all, we don't even literally know how it practically impacted battlefields, right? Because most of what we know is how combined armed tactics worked, and how mostly the most important arm there were men-at-arms, whether mounted or dismounted, and the combination of these elements, right? The rest is fairly speculative, and I've never really liked this. I'm not talking about Eastern in general, but the sense that, again, the direction is the same one anyway. Now the problem is the longbows. All right, I understand this is a British channel, has large, like probably an Anglo-American audience like mine, but we also know that at large it wasn't nothing radically exceptional, scholarly different, dramatically sort of alternative about using longbows as opposed to crossbows. And also the type of defenses would have pretty much looked the same. It's not like we look at Western army, say, oh, look, the English had, or I don't know, the French fighting against them, whatever, had this very different type of armor because of styles or types of whatever, because they were facing long. There was no evidence of any of this. All right, so one thing is scoping against an enemy that naturally has strong missile capacity. Another thing is, pretending to trace this in any positive sense from a historical point of view, and in front of armies that were largely also symmetrical with one another. You're surely much more concerned what happens in melee, or what happens when you're running away, when your formation is broken, then what kind is going to fly from the sky, which is surely another, serious concern, to say the least, but it's not so central as the others, and gets blurred and really diluted in the broader picture. And actually, Easton says, and that's instead what the French did, right, with this type of armor. That's what the English did, he argues. Again, because I think he, as I was saying before, thinks that there was more armor around in that region, essentially northern France and England, Wales. There were naturally also other peoples who used long. But by the way, we know that, there were lots of longbowmen in the armies of Charles the Bold. That, in general, longbows were present historically in every single European country, but there was evidently also a reason if they kept using crossbows, that regardless of how people tend to alchemically fantasize about, physical quantities, whatever, it was mostly an organizational matter, something very, say, collectively expandable, mostly in a broader military art of war sense, rather than look at the performance of the single web. All right, but Easton seems to believe something similar, some of the opposite. However, he says, certain notions like the Scots and the Irish couldn't necessarily provide a lot of armor for themselves economically, and the Germans who came in early former Landsknecht, as we were saying, in fact, who fought at the Battle of Stokefield in 1487, presumably came with their traditional style of German armor. And it seems that this was really poorly suited to face massed English archery, because they got shot to pieces. And it's just one incident, by the way. So much of that one source describes them as looking like porcupines. So now, which is, by the way, something that was said, as you know, notorious of other armored and also padded armored guys in other contexts like the Crusades, Battle of Durillium, and so on. Easton says, so now that I've set all the context there in probably more detail than I originally intended, let's get into actually answering the question. I would like to add, again, probably those Germans were also less armored, right? And also, the Scots had longbowmen, as we well know, that also served in French armies at that point. So armies are different, military traditions are similar, however, and the art of war of these countries is particularly homogeneous. Again, French-English armies did not really differ in any meaningful substance from one another, especially material terms. All right, they were a product of the same level of civilization. They were neighboring countries. They shared the same technologies. They had the same type of armor. There were more important, I would say, political, organizational, logistical reasons why they could be in this or that encounter better or worse equipped. The same goes for the Germans to an extent, even though that example is very late 15th. We know that the Germans had already copied the Swiss model, so it's a completely different picture, right? In any case, an isolated case of some sort of smaller contingent inserted within a specifically dominant English one. So again, in my opinion, it's not that great example. And you see what's the point also here, that the comparative picture of Western warfare is relatively neglected. Not that he doesn't know that, right? But the way it presented is slightly misleading. Not that he doesn't have to make these points. To me, it's perfectly fine if there is a channel that discusses these topics in this way. I'm just here to point out, obviously, as a form of critique, but not in a malign or negative sense at all. I'm very thankful I can discuss this thanks to Matt Easton's work. Now, He says, what are the physical or material things that a common, let's say, English or French lowly equipped men at arms or common soldier, really, we're looking at common soldiers mostly here. What could they do to lessen their risk from mass longbow archery? So the first point is really, so he makes some points, and we'll see now what they are. Because they're fair, but even the ways they're made are sometimes in relation with one another, probably revealing a disproportion of some sort of lack of focus on sort of the broader picture that unites them all. So he says the first point is really blooming obvious. It's actually what was showed in that replica testing. Wear more armor, right? There is one thing: arrows. Again, versus armor demonstrates that this test is that armor usually pretty much most of the time, 90% of the time, works and protects you. This latter point is actually very important, but of course, yeah, we know that not everybody can have that armor around. So as a point, yes, it's just like an abstract solution. It's prescriptive. If you don't have that protection, we're sorry for you. But this also, again, focuses too much on the individual, meaning that even though it's the average soldier, it's not like an average soldier, some people just average people coming in a field and, being showered with longbow bolts. These are part of an organic system that is sort of properly structured in a way that calibrates through also like the as we've seen, also relatively similar, comparable backgrounds of these populations, these countries, in a way that can be military expandable through collective training, combined armed tactics, mostly the successful combination between different units in that sense. So Easton says it doesn't really matter whether, well, it does actually matter, he says, because I'm literally repeating what he said. It's plate or mail. Obviously, plate against arrows is far more effective than mail is. However, usually wear both in conjunction. And as Schwerpunkt, I'm saying this because the type of troops and the average troop that you will have in this battlefields is specifically functional to a specific task, including not being necessarily exposed to this great deal of arrows, at least more than it's necessary. Easton goes on. This shows his armor. He makes other considerations that, again, are relatively unrelated and not repeating what he already says. So anything that's, suppose, armpits, legs, anything else, because it's totally mostly about the face, the visor, and so on. If you can armor it, if you can afford to armor it, or if your lord can afford to provide the equipment for you, then that's a good thing. Yes, okay, but let's also remember that not all troops were naturally, like here we're talking the average trooper, so mostly it's a heavy infantryman in the West. So I absolutely get that we're still talking troops that in general can be more armored as opposed to missile troops as well. That's an interesting aspect we'll see now, and how, in fact, the same missile cooperated with heavies against which target, right? It says, in any case, this increased armoredness is going to massively increase your survival rate. He says, interestingly, in England and France, we even see sometimes archers were normally regarded as people who don't necessarily wear a lot of armor. Sometimes archers wear leg armor. Well, yes, we see it, especially, again, in the later period during the 15th century. Some of it is also artistic license sometimes, but definitely there were armored archers. And there is nothing really strange about that. They also had corselets, for that matter. But Easton points out, like, they had this leg protection because that was naturally an exposed area, especially as an archer, you're not normally protected. And we'll see now also the issue with the Pavises and the Z's shield and so on. It says archers can't necessarily wear a lot of armor on the upper body, but legs are actually a bit vertical part of your target. They're likely to get hit a lot statistically, so if you can't put armor on your legs while you're shooting your bow, that will make you far more invulnerable against enemy archers. And here, he actually makes the point that I would say it's more important is to say most archers, however, did not have leg protection. Typically, they didn't, all right? And they didn't also in times where still, again, taking an arrow, regardless of whether the longbow is more prevalent or not, still hurt in the knee, right, as the meme. And so I would point out that the fact that we just see sometimes, and exceptionally actually, archers that are better armored and that have even leg protection is the proof that normally the lighter component here didn't even need to use that kind of protection because their purpose was something else, and agility, in fact, also the capacity of missile troop to move on the battlefield in loose formation, not in an orderly one, to maintain cohesion. So mostly pointing on speed and, in this sense, exploiting the asymmetries of the battlefield, provided that, again, we always understand the missile element is not prevalent. It's not the dominating arm. It's not the upper one, right, on the battlefield. So it's always something inferior that can also be reached, slaughtered, exactly because they were also less armored, as a matter of fact. We'll see now better what we mean here. So in the general logic of the battlefields, at the end of the day, being even this more exposed missile elements at some point that also tended on the wings to fight against missile elements did not have this great deal of protection, right? I know that some of you, again, is thinking about Pavises, but there is, in fact, a digression later on that because Easton talks about it. He goes on and says, many times in Wars of the Roses, where it was English versus English, but also in the 100 Years' War, we also see often arrows versus arrows. Actually, I would add this Schwerpunkt, that was the norm throughout all medieval history, and not only. I mean, normally, the skirmishing phases, from antiquity, etc., like normally, in most contexts, there would always be, if the especially in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, the battle arrays were symmetrical, right? Meaning that they were fundamentally specular. You wouldn't necessarily have archers versus archers just per se. It would surely happen in this context. Easton is right to point it out, but their target would also preferably be other heavier elements. But at some point, yes, they would fight against one another because in that case, they were normally considered as tailored as being capable of engaging, also in hand-to-hand combat, because at that point they have an equal level of protection with their, in fact, missile counterpart from in the front ranks. So again, I wouldn't make it any particular sort of English particularism even here. Obviously, Crecy is the good example, but we find others. And often the asymmetry in having, for example, not adequately deployed, kept your archers during a battle, even just in terms of battle lines deployments that came, especially as during the 13th century, also during the first half, in particular the 14th century, at different waves during the battle. Not a single back and forth of the battle lines clashing, but say literally the reserve injection into the broader fray could create these issues, which is talking also battlefields extending for kilometers. Also, in interest of time, different things could go wrong in that way. So Easton says, if the archers are more protected, if they can soak up a few hits and not get wounded whilst continuing shooting, they're going to overwhelm the enemy archers if they don't have such good armor. Right? Now, personally, also here, I've never seen a big deal of archers versus archers that ended up those guys had more armor, so they actually won because of that, because they could take more hit. Like this is not really a normal scenario. It's also something that probably the same sources would have not been interested in. First of all, because missile versus missile, nobody cared about. But secondly, because it's hardly a matter of how they were armored or not armored that mattered. All right, number, morale, experience, sort of collective efficiency, terrain would have been way more important. And so, again, if we reconstruct medieval battles, you can't simply say, well, we have to think that, yeah, maybe armor helped. It's an abstract idea, right? If you don't have a specific systemic evidence of this thing going on from the sources, the point is, why are we even talking about this? I understand this is speculative, and I understand that these points are made for the sake of example, and it's somehow important, but to specifically digress on this, I think it's unnecessary. It's something methodologically null, all right? Doesn't add or subtract anything to the ultimate assessment. And we shouldn't be, again, overly concerned with the missile element, because really in these battles was not the more important one, right? And the most important thing in absolute terms was combined arm tactics. So the heavies were the more important arm. The most important thing in any case was the adequate cooperation between these elements, and multiple battle lines and flank attacks by concealed reserves, something like that. Now, Easton says, if you're expecting to face longbows or recurve bows, wear loads of armor because it will save your life. Well, this is easier said than done. And also, simply burdening your army with extra protection is like, how? Haven't we started the video just by saying that the armor-piercing element is somehow irrelevant? Yes, we're talking about a very well-armored opponent, yes, but as we'll see now, there's also shield. So is truly the concern of the common infantrymen of the French, the English armies of the 100 Years' War or any other place to be just overly equipped, overly armored in any meaningful sense just because of the missile element? Don't you want to be armored because you want to defend yourself from any kind of blow or any kind of incident? Or aren't you simply, as we said before, more functionalized on the base of more or less armor on your specific tactical specialty / function in combined arms tactics? I mean, do you really think that the mindset of a fighter in that sense was simply, okay, I'm going to battle, the only, or at least here it's not stated based on, but in general, like the number, the amount of armor here, right? It appears to be a central thing. So you go into battle against the English, they have lots of longbows. Well, how? I don't know, like the French didn't have lots of crossbows. Like there was a gold medium, so to say, that normally had already calculated this equation, and battle was mostly about ripping the guts of the person in front of you. And yes, you may have not reached him because you could have been taken down by a longbow arrow. However, like in general, even here, calculating how much more or less armor you would have just because you had to defend yourself from archery, like it was all baked in the level of armor that normally armies had at the time, and not because they were sort of singling out, okay, now we have to be better protected from the longbow in particular, right? What about the crossbow, right? And again, I studied, medieval warfare for decades at this point. I've never really found an incident where people said, okay, I'm so concerned about this, right? You do find things we've seen also in the Battle of Poitiers, okay, like the longbows are not effective against the enemy horse's chest plate. You have to go around them. Yes, but in order to go around them, either you have, like in that case, some sort of terrain possibility of doing so, and or in a normal pitch battle, in order to go around them, you have to have overwhelmed the enemy wings as well. And that was actually standard tactics all over Western Europe. So again, why the longbow? Why this exceptionalism? Right? There is something always in between that does not simply allow you to scientifically beat the enemy in a prearranged, determined fashion, right? And if a longbow, bodkin or splinter even has to kill you, it will kill you anyway. And again, the objective is not to be overloaded in armor, obviously. And here, of course, the shield will be brought up, but that's also the first thing. You would say, well, how do you defend yourself from missile element? Well, yeah, armor, especially for the heavier element, without shield, they start disappearing at this point exactly because armor was enough for the more heavily armored, and a shield in the other case. All right, so I don't see really I see the logic of the point, but I don't see how particularly poignant it is to the whole discussion. And it says, the next way that the common soldier can be more protected against archery against mass arrows flying their direction, I think often gets overlooked in this sort of arrow versus armor test. He talks about the replica testing. It says, so with mass archery, it's going to hit a mass of people. Now, the one thing that often gets overlooked is we got numerous descriptive accounts of medieval soldiers being packed so closely. This is an interesting point. And I believe it's an Italian source that says that if you threw a football onto them, the football would never touch the ground. There are actually multiple sort of references to this also for cavalry, for that matter. So the point here was not let's go on what Easton really says, because there are also in here, the first thing as a military historian comes into my mind, the order of the battle line, which is heavy infantry, because the missile do not have an order, if not an open one, in fact, is mostly functional to the enemy heavy one. All right. Actually, it's easier to shoot in the masses, also Easton says, but he makes sort of a point. Now we'll try to look at it. It says, in other words, they are squished in so tight that if football would just bounce around their helmets and stay on their shoulders, there is no gap between them. Why is that important for archery? Well, it means that because they are so tightly packed, you're less likely, for example, to be able to see the sides or any kind of openings. If they don't have back armor, you're very, very unlikely to see that as far as shooting them is concerned. But also, if they don't have leg armor, only really the people in the front rank are going to have exposed legs, because everybody standing behind is behind the person in the front, and therefore the arrows can't get to their legs, because what the arrows face is a wall load of people with helmets and their brigandines or plate armor or whatever else is in front, and those arrows will never find their way to the people behind, right? And this is a valid point. It's absolutely the case, and it is the case, again, mostly for the general purpose of this formation, melee. All right, we know this since Xenophon and before. Obviously, the best men were in the front. They were the more capable, the better armored, because you really counted on them. The file openers, the other guys behind followed them. They were thickly packed because they had to go at the enemy or, I don't know, receive a cavalry charge, whatever the circumstances. That's the reason why that was their order. All right, and I would say in this sense, even though you would try to soften up at some point enemy heavies, if they're pinned down, the English did so, for example, the battles like, the ones of the Scottish Wars of Independence, like Bannockburn, etc., they would literally circle with the knights, around the enemy formation to spot the weaker point. The English archers there were useful because, well, not Bannockburn in any case, the English were defeated, but in previous battles, right, they had used profitably their archers, the longbows, but just because they had them, not because there was something scientific about that, to soften up the enemy heavy infantry. And of course, that alone wouldn't break them. So, while it is true, as Easton says, that among other things, if you're thickly packed, you don't kind of expose yourself too much, and you can even create some shield walls in the front with interlocking shields and whatever. And in fact, some guys will have, let's say leg protection. They would be better armored in general, because at the front ranks, most stuff would come at you. Really, in a historical sense, what is the factor in a quantitative percentage sense of armoredness related to the missile element, right, coming at you to protect from? And why should we care? It's not a number you can calculate in historical terms. You can sort of eyeball that, you can feel it sometimes from the sources itself. It is kind of obvious, but because armor also serves different purposes, again, sort of different things. So, yeah, you can say these things do help, but honestly, also in general, like, the more compact, the easier a target you actually are. I mean, literally, cavalry charge, think about the Parthians against the Romans. They would essentially oblige the Romans to close formation when the cataphracts, by showing up the cataphracts, so that actually the horse archers could shoot into the thickly packed formation, had to reopen in open order again to avoid actually the arrow shots. And actually, I think in this sense that this thickly packed formation was the easier to target to begin with, and given that most battlefield tactics were about mass volleys into a zone area, telling you the truth, it would be actually better to have an open formation even when you have gaps, right? Because unless you attack the enemy from the flank, or so where normally he doesn't expect you to be and will take measures for you not to be there, including having wings of archers on his own, frankly, like, you can simply turn against those archers with a shield, and you can have a fairly acceptable degree of protection. And again, it doesn't seem like, I'm not aware of any particular instance where also medieval warfare, especially in this era in the West, missile fire bothered heavy infantry or cavalry formation for which they had to be explicitly particularly packed, or also opening because of the same problem, right? Because the latter would be historically the most frequent case instead. So again, I understand the point, and I understand how, in this sense, Easton's mind is truly fixed on a physical dimension, right? But in terms of military, say, logic, in terms of art-to-war expandability, in battle formations, and sort of tactical purposes, there's not much of an interest. Like, it's not like he doesn't get certain things. I'm sure that in his videos at some point said pretty much what I'm saying right now, and he would agree with most of it himself. But again, you make a video about this, so I understand that these are videos that come here from a loud-thinking person who knows his deal in the field. However, again, if you maybe stop just a minute thinking about it, you see these criticalities, I don't know even how to define them, emerging, right? He says, and by the way, shields historically, because here the point is that the longbow was the big deal, but think about how even the Norman drop-shaped shield would cover the thighs, etc., and how armor increasing would reduce the size of the shield, I was saying before, and how, in fact, also, as those men were fighting on foot, also common infantry had at that point, in fact, shields that arrived to cover their legs largely. But that was an old thing, right? And it happened also for, again, different reasons. How powerful were those infantry classes at some point in history? What kind of enemies they had to cope with, and so on. So it wasn't most about the fact, like, javelins, darts, arrows, and also longbows were actually there all the time. Longbows were used since prehistory everywhere in Europe. Right, they may have not prevalent, but they're just longer bows than the average. Like, the construction is identical throughout the entire history in the West. We made bows only just in one single identical way. So at that point, even the longbow is probably functional to something else that we explained in our series about the 100 Years' War tactics, to a particular context that, however, did not greatly distance itself from, also in terms of power, a ratio from what the opponents had, including, in any case, spectrally in a missile sense, right? Easton says, so by being thickly packed, not only does it inherently make you safer against archery, but it also makes certain parts of your body basically invisible to archery, particularly the legs. And again, I would say also that you have, as Schwerpunkt, if you have a zone fire and you have parabolic shooting, because say the guys have, I don't know, lots of shields, they can also use putting them by putting them over their own heads. You can still shoot in the bunch, actually will tend to hit more people than sort of some scattered forces, especially at the long range, as most missiles were actually used in an effective sense, right? So it's obvious that, I don't know, a close range in a siege context and so on, you would have, some guys were shooting in a quite precise fashion with particular projectiles designed also for that distance. But in general, like, actually it's the packed formation that receives most projectiles, and it's not really the best. In fact, actually there is evidence, for example, in late communal Italian warfare, that the first target of the crossbowmen were the enemy pikemen, that, as we'll discuss later, were well, possibly even equipped with Pavises for that reason, right? And it's still, like, there was a pretty good, use made of this crossbowman against thickly packed formation, exactly in part for that very reason. Because the point, as also Easton said, it's not much armor penetration, whatever. It is all the chaos, like the system decadence that you cause just by showering a formation, has maintained an order, morale, whatever, with all these projectiles. It could be literally, lots of projectiles. And never think that, again, the longbows, oh my god, the longbows caused much greater arrow showers than, I don't know, another army with crossbow. No. the supplies, the logistics, it was comparable. There isn't like, I don't know, the English shoot faster, and that already in itself is a game changer. You will just exhaust your projectiles earlier. In any case, you can just bring so much. The same goes for crossbow bolts. It's the same identical thing. We know of incredibly heavy and thick crossbow fire. So the notion that it was just like the English archers who shot more in interest of, here we're just talking about absolute protection, not even being overwhelmed by lots of arrows at a time. In any case, wherever they hit, even if you shoot them. They'd have more of a psychological impact than a material one, right? If you shoot them all at once, as opposed to diluted in a given amount of time, if they're going to hit, they're going to land on the target, they're going to land on the target in the same way, all right? So, again, this point I don't see as particularly relevant per se, again, also comparatively, and also because of the longbow. And again, I understand that the longbow here is used just because even the title is punching. People say, oh, the longbow, it's something magic special. But even this kind of rhetoric, even if it's subtle, if it's indirect and so on, tends to make people think, again, there was something uniquely special about what would happen if you were under a longbow arrow as opposed to any other one. And so making you think that there's this deep difference that you have to sort out in Western armies because one was like this, they were the same armies, all right? They function in the same identical way. And missile troops are the less important in the game, all right? And so Easton goes on and says, of course, as battlefield commander is a strategic choice to make here. If you have 1,000 infantry and you look at them and you think, well, that 100 have got better armor than the other 900, clearly you put them at the front. So what you do is that you take all your guys who have the most complete armor, biggest pauldrons, the best leg armor, and they have remembered to wear their other elements or chosen to wear, etc. And the most heavily armored people like the knights or the men-at-arms, you put them at the front rank, and therefore all of the lesser equipped people who have got less armor, and some people who might have no armor, those people I spoke about earlier, they are behind. Well, yeah, this happened in every army, but not because generally just the missile element, because those were the better soldiers. They were randomly equipped with better arms and armor. They were just the ones that organically, functionally, and systematically were put at the front because they were essentially largely what made the unit work in that way. And the entire unit worked through that internal logic. It's not much because of what arrives at you. There is a much more important function that comes into combat, into melee, all right? And that is quite much more traumatic, believe me, than a longbow arrow shower, right? So Easton says, therefore, they are shielded from the arrows by better armored people standing in the front. Again, yeah, it's not a huge deal in any case. And actually, as we've seen also in the past videos, these least armored troops, the infantrymen, weren't hardly even the target, say from the rear, at any point of the battle of the longbows or the longbowmen, or the crossbowmen for that matter. Yes, if they were pikemen, because the idea was you have to break the enemy wings in particular. I know that you don't see many pikemen, especially in the 100 Years' War. There were other armies in Europe. In any case, they were there too, and they're probably underrated in that sense. But they're not of the scale and size of where we see, again, the aforementioned examples, for example, in Italian warfare of crossbowmen and pikemen and so on. They were much larger, much bigger. Just one wing of the 6 that a normal, late communal Italian host used was larger than an average pike square of the later Middle Ages. Just I tell you that, right? So, and the crossbowmen were even that many, as we've seen also at Crecy. They were even normally less than, for example, the overall scale of troops that normally the English used in their armies, and still they were able to unlock those pikeman formation through relentless quarrels, fire, and nobody talks about that. Nobody has made movies about that. Nobody talks about it repeatedly. When talk about medieval warfare, nobody thinks they're iconic. We must enter into a very precise order of ideas whereby we must in particular accept that current historiography at large does not have much of an idea of any comparative of diachronic Western European and sort of broader continental or even global history at the time. If you don't understand how Western armies at large worked, comparatively by size, quality, there is not much a way around what also individual armies in single countries work like, because it's all skewed in favor of an incredibly narrow sort of shrinking of the possible pool of sources that by now are readily accessible by anyone, and that, yes, require a pretty large amount of work to browse, research, and so on, but that can't be ignored anymore. All right. Then finally comes to the third way you can protect these unfortunate troops. It says, I'm going to describe whereby people could protect themselves better against arrows. It's also really blooming obvious, and I'm sure a lot of you were thinking of it already. Sure, so again, that's the extent by which Easton knows the whole thing himself since the beginning. Use a blooming great shield, right? I mean, that's obviously what the Romans did, but also this was used in the medieval period. All right, and he actually, in the video, if you watch the video, he picks up a scutum because it does not have a pavise, and again, to an extent, also the curved shape, etc. Aside from the most typical shingle design of the Roman scutum, at least the iconic one here he's using, may fit, especially in the upper part. And so, yes, a shield. That's by far the easiest way to protect yourself, the cheaper, the more practical, and so on. And Easton says, we know that at pretty much the same time as mass archery started to dominate battlefields in the 14th century, a type of shield called a pavise, which really, you could say in many ways, was based on the Roman scutum. So, okay, let's point out this aspect. In general, there aren't many ways to make shields, right? And to claim that the pavise, apologically speaking, was inspired to the Roman scutum, I don't think makes a lot of sense. I mean, you don't really need to be inspired by anything to conceive a shield that protects you, especially because, as you'll see, not much because it's bigger than the average, at least in our conventional definition of the pavise, we attach to a sense of size. But the pavise actually in its etymology refers mostly to the way it was built, right? There were smaller pavises also for cavalry, and the point is that it was layered. There were some hardened leather strata, because pavise has the same etymology of pavement from Latin, and it means basically stratified, right? Beaten through, sort of pressing all these strata together, right? This is exactly how the Romans built their roads, right? Hence the same etymology of the pavement, right? And Easton says, so obviously pavise, we understand now how and why the pavise is developed. In part, yeah, Easton is right. It's also connected with the increase in missile protection. If not primarily, this is debatable, because in any case, the shield in and of itself retains this melee function. And as we've seen, pavises technically were also had also smaller examples. There are also the fixed ones. So actually what we call pavise was more like a broader shield type of construction that was adapted in all sizes and circumstances, which is not really the most conventional definition of the pavise, because people are fixated with categories. But again, you have mostly that basic function of the shield also into hand-to-hand combat, and again, to claim that it's just because of that, at least maybe the specialization of, say, the outlining of the pavise as a model in construction and the more iconic size was indeed an extension due to missile protection, I would say that, but still remember there is a core that has to do with what you have to do with these shields in melee, all right? And Easton says, the pavise came along, and the pavise was widely used for attacking castles during siege, where, okay, this is the typical... I've just written an article, I shouldn't say too much about this on the topic, and also the fact that these shields would have just been used mostly for protecting from castle attack. It's something that we see a lot I'd say not even a lot, right? In iconography in general, we see, again, surprise, surprise, soldiers with shields that attack fortifications, because we don't have actually from this age like big depictions of battle formations. All right, we start having something like that in the later century, but they're just very stylized. They do not care about the actual formation. They care about showing that there were lots of people, and they're just maybe you have 10 in detail that are shown together, and you understand that that has very few to do with how troops were actually deployed. And I found, I will not make any name, but I also criticize them. There are top military history scholars that go about things. Look, here we see one archer that goes past, I don't know, a shield, a Pavisier battle line, and that's how they actually use. They protect the Pavisiers protected the crossbow. I mean, that is a heavy battle line, and there are some archers jumping around. Well, how do you derive this notion? This is the other BS that I'm veritably waging a crusade against. The notion that the Pavisier was conceived just to hold the shield to protect the archer. It's a pile of BS. There is no actual evidence of this, all right? There are cases also in ancient history, think about the Syrians, where you find these bigger shields that were at some point used probably by a bear or something like that. But in actual late medieval European warfare, this connection is not quite there. There were fixed Pavises that were used. There were sometimes crossbowmen with Pavises on the shields who turned to reload their crossbows, crouched so that nobody would shoot them in the back with a Pavise slung on it. But the notion that there was even 1/3 of the army of the infantry being just Pavise bearers as opposed to actual fighters in melee, as most Pavisiers actually were, just to hold the shield for the guy who's reloading the missile, is, in my opinion, not just sci fiction, but it's also like not supported by any evidence that we have out there, and it's an incredible mistake. Again, fixed shields during sieges in the context also of semi-permanent fortification, it's full of that stuff, and some of them were really modeled on the basis of Pavise. But in open field, we're talking major battle tactics, wasn't much of this to begin with, and these Pavises could be used by a single guy. There's also this notion that Pavise was very heavy. This is absolutely not true. That's yet another big prejudice. Some of them were actually fairly light, were a bit like the Roman scutum, really, 8 kilos or even less probably in some cases. For the individual guys who use that in combat, even knights had that, and not even necessarily the one particularly smaller type. So again, there is a lot of confusion that stems mostly from over-categorization. If you look at all the sources, and especially at not just at the 100 Years' War one for English, French manuscripts, perhaps, there's much more out there, and also something much more detailed in general. But hey, studying other countries, never mind, because that could be too dangerous. In any case, Essence, I understand why he says that, because the very few things that have been written on the Pavises, just a bunch of articles, mostly talking about just the 100 Years' War, nothing else, right? So that's unfortunately a big problem. And again, I will not make any names of those who also just kept citing those without any other interest in other fields. And also here, for example, Easton says, because during sieges, the enemies were shooting lots of arrows down. Well, yeah, but I mean, compared to mass formations in open field, was that really sort of more an intense fire from siege warfare from the defenders, right? Individually, maybe you could have been obviously very watchful. You would have used your shield against those, enemy postations. However, in general, we're still talking mostly individual guys, and probably attacks were launched in you could normally, through the sheer number of the assailants to the walls, outpower the enemy shooting, which would have probably even killed someone, but that was acceptable as a loss given the bigger picture. So when people just reason through arms and armor in individual soldiers, I'm not here specifically talking about Easton, just know that that's not a good sign of military historical expertise. It's an incredibly narrow, simplistic, and superficial, iconistic heresy, not a proficient study of the art of war, right? Nor in theory, nor in practice. Then Easton goes on and says it was also this Pavise was also used on the front ranks of infantry forces. True, right? And he says in Italy sometimes entire infantry forces had Pavises and a spear. Yes, probably an emulation of what they read about the Romans. Wrong. All right. And on top of this, I was watching the video today. He uses, when he says sometimes entire infantry forces had Pavises with a spear, he holds the shield in front of him and with the other arm in the back, raises the hand, showing like some sort of throwing, in which absolutely was there. There are even depictions of Pavisiers or other guys at least with smaller shields telling the truth. And there the terminology is also foggy to tell it all. Throwing javelins, whatever. But the actual thing that happened in Italy, and that probably happened also in other places, but in Italy it's definitely more pronounced, is that not just entire infantry forces had the Pavise, but they had not a spear/javelin, but a freaking pike. All right, and the way it was used was actually with the Pavise slung over the shoulder. We don't have much evidence. We have actually evidence of very big shields used, even just with a single hand, a bit like the Roman scutum, right, and a very big, and a pike, right, in the other hand. But if you were, I don't know, a pikeman in the front ranks, you could kneel, you could use the pike with both hands and having the Pavise slung in front of you or even fixed on the ground, all right? After all, even before fighting another, the scutum was placed on the ground. I mean, 8 kilos is a lot. I don't know if you ever tried to keep an 8 kilos luggage in your hand alone as a shield with that grip. You know, you get exhausted immediately. And so here, actually, the point really is that those front ranks guys would have used the heavier equipment, including the pikemen, one plus a shield that maybe in that case they were the better armored if the shower of arrows had ended and they had to pass to hand-to-hand combat. They could throw away the shield, or actually could throw away the pike, pass to the sword, which they also had, and attack. These were some of the best forces in the armies of the time, and there is evidence of this in late communal Italian warfare. We, if anything, could look at that at some point, because these infantry formations in Italy were quite unique. They were the best infantry in Europe, and so that's where you find the best documentation, iconography, and so on. But there's a lot of work to be done still. So the entire notion, they had inspired themselves to the Romans. I don't know how to say, but very big shields existed from a very long time. Just today I was preparing a video the other day about Ottonian War. You have some 10th century manuscripts that show massive shields. All right, they existed in the 11th, in the 12th century. They were very similar to what a Pavise later conceptually was. And as we've seen, it wasn't even about the size that made it Pavise, but its construction, as a matter of fact. So, and even that would have probably not differed dramatically from how a shield was made. To claim that the Italians were inspired by the Romans, why? It's a shield, it's a heavy shield. How do you want to build it? Do you have to take inspiration from Rome? You see how individualistic, mechanicistic, deterministic, materialistic these kind of explanations are. It's not because, I don't know, maybe they had the largest armies of the era, they had the best equipment out there, they had more complex tactics out there. Maybe there was a reason if that shield came around, including crossbow fire. Now, they might have inspired themselves to the Romans. I made videos about this stuff, especially for Renaissance warfare, saying, that there is probably a branch of modernistics that began to say, they began to emulate the Macedonians with the pike, the fire. It's BS, that evolved simply because of how civilization was evolving at the time. It had barely to do. When they explicitly armed people as if they were Roman legionnaires or Macedonian pizzatairoi, that, in the actual application of that. Again, modernism has made it stick to this strange idea that you take inspiration from things as if armies were not complex enough systems that really developed on their own through sheer practice in open sort of major engagements. And, it was just a matter of one guy one day says, let's copy this because look, 1,000 years ago they did that. I don't know, I find it funny, but So Easton says, in addition, crossbowmen used them for loading their crossbows so that they'd be protected while they were reloading. However, I would add that for the period in question, yes, we're talking 14th, 15th century. In the latter period, you see, I said it myself, these crossbowmen that used literally the shield on their backs to turn while reloading, being protected from arrows. But it's not very typical, and it's also fairly late in time. The bigger armies are really at the second half of the 13th, the first half of the 14th century, and there isn't actually any evidence of that. And that's actually where the most intense hail of arrows happened, just by sheer scale of the armies. Not even the 100 Years' War was so much into that thing. And it's just a matter of scale and concentration, whatever. Easton says, however, it wasn't widely done in England and France. So we're talking Pavises here. That's what he refers to. We've really got very little evidence. And I would say, well, actually French infantry, like there are lots of Froissart manuscripts. There are lots of different manuscripts from the same era, like France, Flanders, England, that show pretty big Pavises type, used by the way by melee forces that do not use this as fixed shields, but literally in their hands for melee, and protect basically from their, interestingly enough, from their nose, say, from their mouths, till their thighs or even below their knees. They're massive shields, very much in line with what Easton says in terms of protecting the gaps, as a matter of fact, and they have also this relatively concave form so that they partially protect also the flanks of the soldier. That is also a bit individualistic in that sense, a bit like the Roman legionary. Yes, they were all trained to fight in formation, but when you see a shield that is not flat, that mostly a militia will use because they mostly have to literally shield themselves behind it. When you see that concave dimension, that speaks professionalism. That speaks that guy has an aggressive attitude that brings him also to expose his flanks during combat, and not simply right. And it fits with the general increasing professionalism of these retinues that were also better equipped, as Easton said at the beginning, starting from the mid-14th century. All right, so we are in those times. Easton says there is a few isolated evidence of Pavises being used in the Wars of the Roses. However, I would say the 15th century is exactly the moment in which those shields disappear. I mean, the Pavis ends in the 15th century. So for Easton to says, well, during the Wars of the Roses, you have few of them. Look, they existed, as we said before, as something adapted to some circumstances, but that it was truly maybe at that point more connected with the archer, the cross, not even the crossbowman at that point, because he couldn't reload by turning. That was mostly something done by crossbowmen. Yes, there were some, even knights who used the big pavis, and so there are different reasons for that. We're going to talk about pavis now, including the fixed one, because again, it's a big thing. But definitely in the 15th century, we see the pavis going, right? Because they didn't need shields anymore at large. And in fact, with the Wars of the Roses, we're also fairly late in time, from the 50s to the 80s. We said it before, like the Germans that arrived from the continent already fought probably in a different way. Probably it's not like they were less armored, but probably also had perhaps less shields, right? Less pavises that would have been common instead from the previous centuries. Easton says, in the Wars of the Roses, we literally have two archery armies, two English armies fighting each other at one time. We should, as Schwerpunkt, I said this because I made a video about also the tactics of the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses are very sort of peculiar wars in a political sense. This is not much about coping with the French army that was, regardless of its defeats, but also victories, a formidable force that forced the English, in fact, also to give their best, really. At that point, it was mostly a dynastic struggle within Britain. The country wasn't even particularly destroyed by that. It was English versus English. Like the English will remain competitive until the mid-16th century, and you really need Cromwell's forces to have a proper settled armies in a modern sense, right? The English had their own thing. Still, the longbow, again, functionally used up to the mid-16th century, but in peculiar circumstances. And Easton says, So why didn't they make wider use of Pavises? So Wu, right, in the Wars of the Roses, the English in particular, because indeed the English are not overwhelmingly associated with the Pavise, but also how much actual iconographic evidence we have, and what does that actually tell? Because I'm sure that the English use the Pavise also as a melee shield of some sort. So it's mostly a matter of evidence, it's not evidence of absence, which is not just for saying that, but because in these feudal countries also the representation of infantry was not that proliferating. In the 15th century, yes, those retinues that were better equipped, still they show actually lots of Pavises at Similia, at least, in a bit of a stylized way. You know, all those Froissart manuscripts. It's different from the earlier time, again, of where, these shields would have been, at least it would have been way more troops on the field, and there were lots of those shields, etc. We don't see that, especially from France and from England at that time, that their local art did not represent this. Again, you have to mostly look at central, northern Italy for that kind of evidence at that point, and that tells you, again, how it was likely not a matter of, again, they didn't use the shields. It's just that they're not represented, right? So Easton here, I don't know whether he's speaking as early as that, still remaining to the Wars of the Roses instead for the latter part. Also, it's not that, again, the Pavise was not even a thing anymore in practice. He says, I think it's part of it is logistical. Pavises are actually quite laborious to make, very difficult to transport. They're not cheap items. They're very heavy, quite cumbersome. There is no evidence of this. This is the stereotype of the Pavise. If you look at sources, and I know there's very few research on this, but it's much sort of wider than one thinks, and it's much less categorical than one thinks. The myth that the Pavise was mostly just a heavy, cumbersome shield fixed somewhere difficult, no. There were, for example, in saying Italian armies, there were literally several thousands of melee troopers equipped with Pavises, all right? And were also the other types of shield probably were very similar. So no, we see also them in French, Flemish art in particular. There is some consistent amount of those, if you want to call it Pavises, which has not yet been categorically observed by scholarship, but fundamentally, for what I've seen, it is really the case. And again, I'm coming up with a new piece of this. In any case, Easton says, so in some ways they might reduce the offensive capability of your force. No, that's also not true. Like, these Pavises are witness to having, that there is this stereotype about the defensivism of the Pavise. There is no evidence of that. We see Pavisiers routinely involved into hand-to-hand combat in documentary sources. We see them just in the front ranks, formations with some very dynamic infantry forces. We see them literally fighting, also iconographically speaking, with incredible ease, even with an athletic, equilibristic, like movements and so on, scaling walls with Pavises. Again, I'm not talking history here in general, but if you say, no, that's not true because the Pavise could not be, just know that you do not know then anything about medieval sources, both documentary or archaeological, right? Because the Pavise was used like that, and there is quite a lot explicit evidence of it, and I can even provide you with it. Easton then says, this being said, there is one standalone source that I'm aware of which mentions potentially using Pavises at Azincourt because they knew, remember the samplers, here I'm reading the script. I remember he was talking about Bouchicot in the video, because the script here is YouTube not understanding French names, because here Azincourt is Adzenor, transcript. And the Bouchicot was allegedly essentially coping with English archers with the Pavises. Again, it's absolutely normal for Pavises to have existed at the time of Azincourt in both French and English ranks. So again, there is nothing strange about it, and this shield was pretty much everywhere, especially in Western Europe. And even in the East, there were some forms of Pavises. For example, the Lithuanian one, but it's just because it's called like that. And indeed, it is, because it was a cavalry shield, also some kind of asymmetrical one similar also to the Targe, because they intersected in terms of designs, of composition, etc. And so again, things are a bit more complicated than they sound, but I promise to make more videos on the subject. So talking about differentializing cours, Matt Easton says they knew the problem posed by English archers, and so their entire battle plan was about taking out the English archers, which they had suffered from gravely oblivious accuracy, put in a bunch of other smaller battles. By the way, at Poitiers, we've seen that actually those archers weren't the cutting edge of the matter, right? We don't see at the Battle of Poitiers any specific information regarding that battle went the way it did because thanks to the longbows as opposed to the crossbow. Right, it was mostly, if anything, a matter of deployment of forces of fighting in the middle. Like contemporaries did not care about the longbow in that sense. So here you see the projection of the fact that happened because of the longbow. Those French were just thinking about the longbow. Probably they didn't care that much. I mean, it does include there were different reasons why they could also take on the English archers' wings that probably were not even composed just by archers, also because they could fight back, and it wasn't just because of stakes or whatever. We know that the French units were under strength, so everything can easily be mitigated. A bit like, again, the longbowman versus the Genoese crossbowman at Crécy. It's not a compare. Like, you can't compare the performance of those forces as if they were on even odds, right? It's something really notorious, right? Houston says, however, it seems that the Pavises weren't actually used as Azincourt. Maybe things would have turned out differently if they were. Why? Well, how do you know that they weren't there, right? Were you there? It's not like we know really well what actually happened at Azincourt. Let's be honest about it. It's not like they were there just because we have evidence of that, or they weren't there because we have no evidence. We have rightly incensed the importance of these battles, but when it comes to what the description, the reconstruction of what actually happened in a scientific historical sense, like we know, the more we dig into that, the more we realize that we have no idea about most of what actually happened. In any case, Easton says, so shields are always an option. Well, they were there universally by default for heavy infantry, so they're more than an option, I would say. Easton says, however, be aware that they weren't as widely used in the medieval period as you might think, that there were a bunch of complicated reasons. I don't know if you're talking about Pavises or shields, because shields were in any case always used. There was always a heavy infantry component. They always had shields, right? Unless they were so heavily armored, they could use, I don't know, think about the double-handed axemen. They would link their shield on their back, rather than still using it in a sense. But the shield was sort of overwhelmingly present. Here is probably talking about the Pavises, right? Because he's singling out the Pavises as the answer to the longbow, and that's not quite the case. And remember that Pavise developed first in Italy, right, in central Italy, and then spread largely from the rest of Western Europe. Probably it's not even from there, meaning it was developing also in other countries, but we don't have quite clear evidence of that. There's no doubt the Italians made greater use of that, and that was the place where the heaviest amount of missile fire through crossbows concentrated in open field was done. It was sort of bigger than the battles of the 100 Years' War that also belonged to a slightly different period, even in terms of size of armies, right? And that makes a lot of sense. Just like, I don't know, the Lithuanians fighting against the Mongols in Ruthenia, right? And developing the shields for horsemen, for example, that are called Pavises. There is always a reason. And yes, this would point out to the fact that it would be essentially designed for coping with missile fire, but it's not because those guys did not have a shield before. It's mostly like a particular form of shield that develops like that. But let's also debunk the idea that the Pavise was particularly bigger than other shields. It was mostly the composition. And so in that sense, maybe it is because of an increased effectiveness against penetration mostly. But anyhow, Easton says, also to be honest, depending on what type of soldier you are, if you're holding, for example, long pike, or you're armed with something like a halberd or a poleaxe, you can't really use these things conveniently when also having a pavise. I would disagree with that, because again, if we don't really have much iconographic evidence of these guys, say, using a pike with both hands and the pavise slung on the shoulder, but prominent scholars who studied this believe that that was the case. It could also be just stationed in the front, and maybe you could also get rid of that, especially if you had a heavily armored guy, even though at that point you would have not needed much protection, but still from the front being sort of protected in general, also not just for missile fire, was important. And we see actually pikemen using pavises, just standing like with the pike and the shield on the ground, held with the respective hands, and we're told that those guys use that kind of pikes with pavise. So definitely with the halberd and the double-handed axe, definitely that's absolutely true. They were not used with the pavise, but the pike could be used with pavise. All right. Easton says there are some isolated images of people carrying a halberd with a pavise, so they did probably do it sometimes. Yes, that's in part also true, but by and large, if your main weapon is two-handed, it's not very conducive to also carrying a big, heavy shield. But it depends also what you have to do with that. And also you may have a side weapon as well, as it is apparently the case also for most of the heavier types as we've seen before. Easton says, but that being said, would the pavise use the pavisier use of work against pavise use of work against mass archery? Yes, and I think it's really a shame that we don't have any examples from history, at least medieval history of English longbowmen, coming up against a pavise equipped force, because I think it really would have changed the nature of the battle. All right, so as Schwerpunkt, I told you, they hadn't. All right, the notion that the nature of the battle would have been changed because there would have been a pavise facing a longbow, as if just even the longbow changed the nature of the battle, holds no water whatsoever. Like, these shields were more or less universal all over Western Europe. If they are documented, not documented, it's not important exactly, because it was not important, because that was the standard. And frankly, the fact that you had, pavises, yes, could help you maybe better against missile fire, but everybody did it everywhere. Also with crossbows, and also more intense level of foot. So again, it has nothing to do with that. Battles were not won or lost because one side had longbow or the pavise. All right, these weapons were fundamentally symmetric from both sides. Even crossbows and longbows used in collective formations rendered the same effecting scale in the field. There is really no evidence to suggest otherwise, and the pavise too, right? It was just a normal shield, just a bit more improved for coping against mostly penetration, and everybody used it. And of course, it was used in the 100 Years' War, and the English fought against pavisiers. And there are examples of French troops using that also as a pretty standard kind of shield at a point. So it was really the norm, and I don't see again where this whole thing comes from. That instance says, okay, so the last few points about what you can do if you're an infantryman, like I'm portraying right at this second, and your job is to take out those archers, and those archers are going to shoot as many arrows as quickly as they can at you. Well, the infantryman didn't really do much of this. All right. First of all, we're not looking at single individuals. We're looking at battlefield formations that fought quite separately from one another. Pavisiers formed their battle line. The archers would have likely shot from the rear if they were unmasked, and otherwise they were skirmished back and forth. Even during the siege warfare, even again, a guy arrives and they shoot arrows at you. Like, it's not like you're more or less protected because you're facing that as opposed to crossbow bolts. Maybe a minimal change, but everything is in that individual sense can change so much given the individual circumstances that it doesn't make even much sense to presume you can predict it. Equally, or conversely, in large engagements, that's also something much more narrowed down to an optimum that both sides more or less are balanced on the base of, right? So Easton says, so the first one, so he repeats the point, bit of life advice is cover your gaps. Okay, now this might sound obvious, but we may actually have historical sources mentioning this. So say, for example, you have a helmet here. Let's use this example. I have an eye slit here and I have an open mouth. I don't have... Oh, right. This is too much. Like, this has nothing. You understand that mass volleys at this point, you said yourself that it wasn't much about armor penetration. So in this sense, it wasn't even much about exploiting so many gaps, because armor would have been designed, if it was designed to stop projectiles, was also optimized for integrating, I don't know, the possibility of receiving a hit through the eye slit as part of the game. So again, in the economy of panoply, like, this is not how things are going to work, right? It's too individualized. This perspective is too individual. That's not how battles are fought and won or lost. It is mostly a collective dimension. It has to do with combined arm tactics. And in that sense, technology, individual weapons are ever less important in the bigger picture. So he says... he goes on with this example of the armor at that point, and he talks about the replica testing again. That again has nothing really to do with the topic of this wall thing. So he continues, if arrows are shot at your face, again, and this was not normally something that happened in the way arrows were normally shot on battlefield, that is, hundreds of meters of distance. All right. And also at closer range, but definitely also at 10 meters of distance, you can barely aim at somebody's face. You would do in a closer range. In any case, as a formation, first of all, if your archers are so close to an enemy coming at you, you're not in a good place to begin with. And the entire notion that, again, the archers of the 100 Years' War met the enemies arriving just in the front ranks because they were face to face to them is not right. All right. Aside from Azincourt, that finds this French numerical superiority for which they decided to attack the wings, where there were also melee troops to escort to support the archers. The archers were mostly on the wings, and not only that, but they made back and forth because they were in loose formation. Sometimes they came back, they were routed, they came back, right? In that sense, functionally, the closer a heavy element is to your archers, and the less your archers are effective, as a matter of fact. You're in hindsight, like when you think about these greater engagements, the normality was to target the enemy at a congruous distance for a prolonged amount of time, right? Having guys coming at you and needing to use those arrowheads designed for shooting at closer range was more like an emergential situation that you had to, yes, probably fight yourself out of, but it wasn't like normally battles were fought, right? Normally, just like in the whole rest of Europe, the wings had this missile element, and the wings faced one another. So either missile versus missile, and or heavy plus infantry plus missile. And this is pretty much the same everywhere. Again, there's nothing particularly different about the longbow. There are these iconic moments here and there taken as flashes, as movie scenes reimagined in our own way, saying, look, the longbowman shot at close range these guys. Normally that happened only if you had already outflanked them and you could target them where they were engaged in combat, and that's why you wipe them out. Not because of the longbow is powerful, but because, if you're outflanked while you're in combat, you're already done for. Right, and your own wings had collapsed. So it's a dreadful situation. That's how battles were designed to be won, regardless of whether those on the flanks were longbowmen or crossbowmen. We have pretty substantial amount of evidence about all this for all Western Europe. So again, insisting on the longbow, in my opinion, is counterproductive in a deep pop cultural sense. So it really goes on and on with this tips on how to not expose this or that part of your body, an armored part of your body, to arrows. All right. And then he goes on, because he partly repeats what he said. This one is really obvious if you think about it, but I think it might escape a lot of people. Move quickly, he said. Okay, so archers have pretty much a fixed rate of shooting. There's only a certain speed the most longbowmen will be able to shoot an arrow, knock a new arrow, draw a new arrow, release an arrow, do the same over and over again. is a good archer can have a faster rate of shooting than a poor archer. And this is potentially mentioned in historical sources, but they can't accelerate themselves beyond what their maximum capacity is. Your rate of movement, however, is dictated by how fast you can run forwards. And the more time you take to get to the archers, the more arrows are going to hit you. So I would like to remember your Schwerpunkt that this whole thing was about the average infantryman. All right, the average infantryman, as a heavy guy with a shield in front of you, does not give a damn about archers, and is not closing gaps to reach the archers. Normally, the archers, if a block of heavy infantry is moving ahead, they have to get the hell out of the way quickly. All right, they're not in the position of creating much of a problem. We said it before. Actually, pikemen were targeted horrendously at some point by crossbowmen, for example, in Italian warfare, although those were that normally happen either by outflanking them or from an elevated position. The only cases we don't have, say, a frontal destruction of pike, also because we don't understand either clearly how heavy infantry and missile troops cooperated in the wings, right? Something that there are all different speculations, but at the end of the day, it's more likely that they actually shielded one another, that the Pavises, in that sense, guys equipped with shields, with heavy infantry, far from being twin soldiers of crossbowmen with one per each to screen while reloading, were actually just to block the heavy infantry in the front. And the missile troops during the actual melee were, and in the sort of during the back and forth between the single combats, were just behind in or around, and they tended, by the way, to fire, sometimes also in an orderly fashion. We see rank fire sometimes also in the Middle Ages with crossbow, if they were very well drilled at Similia. So the notion that there is this problem is because you would think, well, if it is cavalry, that is true, but cavalry wasn't even caring about those archers. I mean, even if they bothered them, the main problem is, say, no cavalry charge was ever stopped by archers. Like, cavalry charges were stopped by heavy infantry or other heavy cavalry, and the charge was all what that was about. Like, archers could bog you down a little bit, but there is no evidence that they stopped you in any way. So this constant over-exaggeration of archery. Like, you understand also most of this debate on this channel revolve around the longbow, right? It's almost monothematic. Not quite, we've seen also heavies and so on, but it always revolves around here, closing the gap with archers. Who does that on the field? I mean, you have an infantryman, you have much better to do than closing gaps with archers, right? We are brutally, traumatically, over-exaggeratingly, overestimating archers, right? This is a serious problem. Like, seriously, look at how they actually fought battles at the time. Missile troops were essentially auxiliary in nature. That's what mostly did. They were the light troops for a reason, right? Because the heavies are the stronger one, the battle-winning one. In combination with the missile, there's no doubt, but still, all right? And so this notion, you have to run because, the archers shooting you. Who does that, right? Which kind of heavy infantry has to hurry, especially as heavy infantry, so to get winded and exhausted in running with heavy equipment that you told me is the best thing you can use against an archer to close the gap with them. Like, again, all battles, it does make sense that, of course, you want to gap the distance to arrive before they have shot at you, but, I mean, units in this historical warfare are already calibrated in a more or less standardized tactic, battle deployment. They already know what to do. They're already framed with a very specific role. It's not some of random scissor, paper, stone kind of, let's see what's the one that wins. Like, it doesn't work like that. And Instant says that every single one of those arrows might find a gap. Again, you have a shield. The archers are in the front, unless they outflank you, which is never a good thing, because if they outflank you, it's because you're facing an enemy and you're fighting with it in the front, and it's melee. It's even more important. It's not even the damage of the archers, it's the psychological effect. You're done for. So again, if you advance against archers with a shield protecting you, roughly, you have a helmet on your head, a shield in your front, more or less you're shielded. Then arrows can count you, they can wound you, but again, it's more like the archer scared view than the other way around. Easton says, so this has to be married with the idea that you are in a large group of people. Yes. Well, and clearly you don't want to just trip over and fall over each other, because then you'll be a horrendously exposed target. Also, as we know, nobody ran in those circumstances, if not in the very last meters or something. So these things could even happen, but normally troops, even under fire advance, were orderly, right? And the chances are, by the way, that the least trained, they also the worse equipped they were. And if you sent them in this sense against the archers, the more losses they would take. And so it would have been even less likely for them to be sent against the archers. So it's, if they ever did, like, so, no. And Easton says, you want to bunch in all together, or do you? We'll come into that final point. But let's say you're in one big mass and you want to shuffle forwards and gain ground on the archers as quickly as possible. What did archers do to counter this? Well, they put their good old friendly wooden stakes again, and because he made a video about this, and I wanted to answer, but it was fair video. And wooden stakes are probably not something so overwhelmingly genial or innovative or exclusive. It is true they start appearing mostly in the battle accounts in the later Middle Ages, and there is all a story. And actually, the video that Easton made is fairly well done, about the one about wooden stakes. But even there, like, the fact that wooden stakes would have not been used otherwise is not very plausible. And it's not even just wooden stakes that are simply creating a special barricade that stops. No, right? That's not really how this works. No fortification works unless it's manned properly, and even then it can be overrun. So if we're talking missile troops, they're not magically becoming something more, unless there is a massive field fortification, which at that point may be the case. But simple wooden stakes fixed into the ground, they can be a problem, but they're not going to be the game changer. They're going to help, but they're not going to be this hyper relevant thing. Here, Easton, by the way, makes a valid point. He says, it's not much the wooden stake, in fact, that does the thing, but is also, in part, at least combined with the fact that the closer the enemy cavalry approaches the archers are shooting them, like it has in Kur, which is the only actual episode in which cavalry is stopped like that. So it's not really overly typical. Yes, it was used later, but there are also many different reasons all over Western Europe, while armies are becoming ever more dismounted, also men-at-arms, and there are much more field fortifications. We've seen them in many other battles. So it's not even about the English longbow, and their wooden stakes. However, he makes a fair point, because he says, these stakes were useful to the degree the enemy, by approaching the enemy archers, was ever more damaged by them. And so he would accelerate, and this would create an irrational counterindication, because at speed you would get impaled more easily on those stakes. We know, however, that literally this cavalry was trained enough to stop, because they're the nobility, they know how to do this under fire. They would also, the Battle of Nicopolis that Easton treated in the video about wooden stakes, like they began to dismantle these things, they literally stopped them. So this happened also during the 100 Years' War, for that matter. So yes, that's not typical for a cavalry charge, but it's not even just necessarily properly a cavalry charge in the top fashion. First of all, at Azincourt, as we said, the French were dramatically understrengthened in the wings, because they literally had said we were simply going to rout them, and there was all the reasons why the French army was not disciplined at that point. But the true charge, even though down on foot, it's still the heavy mass of men-at-arms in the center. And that's what matters. So these wooden stakes were not the saviors of the day, all right? Not even at the Battle of Nicopolis. That's how things worked, or in other instances. Again, wooden stakes are part of something more, and alone, they're not really the game changer. Then Easton makes some example from 19th century warfare that here relatively interests us, right? So he says, however, at the Battle of Azincourt, they used wooden stakes. At the Battle of Nicopolis, the Turks, the Ottomans, used stakes as well. It's all about holding back those forces so that you can't keep shooting your arrows at them. So reverse that. What does the infantryman want to do, right? close on the archers as quickly as possible. So the final thing that I would suggest it's worth the infantrymen thinking about doing, or rather the infantry force thinking about doing against mass archery, and this isn't necessarily a good idea, but it's something to think about. And I think, so I would add one thing as Schwerpunkt. As we said before, wings normally were composed by both heavy and missile troops. All right, so they normally fought against one another in the same way. All right, so this difference gets normally flattened. There isn't much of an infantry unit that has to hurry to close the gap with archers. All right, because normally archers are not even deployed in the front against heavy infantry. You know why? Because archers do not stop heavy infantry. And so they can, the heavy infantryman can run, but he will still dislodge the archers from the place. Equally, they are also supported by archers, and chances are that in fact this infantry is not going to fight against archers. It's going to fight against other heavy infantry like them that are in front of the archers, and that's normally how armies fought, right? It is true that we don't know too much about this and that, but it's kind of the most logical thing. And even if, for example, if you don't have any infantry in that sense, you're in a disadvantage with only missile troops facing that. And so stakes, not stake, longbow, not longbow, you're light infantry. You're done for against heavy infantry. Easton says, and I think a final point to launch some discussion down in the comments, so I will not comment on scholagladiatoria, but let's say I made this video, so it is. And I don't remember actually today watching this the video, what kind of thing this was. And this is split up, he says. Easton says, now I told you, if you group together, you're better armored. This is true. Okay, the closer you pack in, and this seems to be from the written sources, this is what most medieval soldiers did. It is they packed themselves in as closely as possible and put their heads down and moved as quickly as they could without falling over each other on those archers. They did so because they fought against other heavy infantry. They had to be thickly packed. Normally, heavy infantry did not care about archers to begin with, right? And Easton says that instead that it was done, and in order to reduce the number of arrows hitting them and the amount of time that they were being hit by arrows, but potentially if the landscape allows it, then splitting up and flanking around the archers has a very important effect, right? Flanking around the archers, right? And the same Easton says, and what is it? If there is more gaps between each soldier, more of the arrows are likely to find gaps and to be redundant, to be wasted. Okay, when you're packed in, you pretty much know that every arrow is going to hit your force. It might have less effect because you're packed in close and you don't have very many vulnerable openings. But if you split up, then those arrows very likely won't hit a lot of you and they'll go between the gaps and you essentially divided the fire. So yes, you remember what I said as Schwerpunkt before. He gets it. He knows that. Easton says, you split up the shooting, the archery coming from those longbow, and it means that they're now shooting a lot of people all around here, and the arrows aren't concentrated on one killing zone and one sort of bottleneck. Okay, so it's another way of doing things, and it's very clear that it is exactly what Marshal Boucicaut had in mind at the Battle of Azincourt, because his original plan was to flank around in two wings of cavalry and hit the archers from either side. What did the archers do to counter this? We know they had wooden stakes, as mentioned before, in front, but they also had ground, and this was very common English stacked woods either side of them, and other ground, which meant that the cavalry weren't able to do this, and they had to come up in the middle. All right, so this is actually now remembered from the video what this has, and I will add something for telling you how deeply sort of, I will say it is not a problem, but how deeply Anglo-centric this perspective is. I mean, attacking enemy infantry wings with cavalry was routinely done in Western warfare. All right, this is not an overarching sort of genius of Marshal Boucicaut. That was definitely one of the great commanders of the era. All right, here they can't outflank the English wings because there are woods. All right, now it was normally done. And not only they did that with cavalry, but often with archers themselves. I have lots of examples from medieval warfare in the 13th, 14th century, which this was routinely done. Specifically at Azincourt, The point is that we think that there weren't just archers in the wings. There were heavies, right? Because also they put up a fight at the stakes, and so it would have not been even just if the men-at-arms were at the center. Yes, there were the heavies of the retinues together with them, all that kind of stuff, but there would have been some heavies also in the wings, normally. This is what normally happened in the rest of Western Europe, and if it didn't happen, it wasn't a good sign of development, all right? So the English chose a great position. I made a video about Henry V recently. The point, though, is that the reason why the French screwed up attacking them in the front was apparently that they sucked as a unit. They were radically understrength. They weren't good for much. And so here, this passed down to history as the English archers stopped a cavalry charge, but we don't have, first of all, like any evidence that were just archers. B, evidence that the French were particularly fit for that task, right? Otherwise, the outflanking would have been completely normal if you had the possibility of attacking the enemy with a flank, with a concealed unit, by the way. That didn't have to be even the entire unit or the entire wing turning about. Normally, this was probably not done, especially for attacking missile troops, all right? It wasn't done in general. Like, wings, again, were normally heavy, and they fought against one another, and the outflanking was done by some concealed pocket of cavalrymen, chosen ones that had to pick the best moment in the battle to attack the enemy wings when they were engaged against your own, right? And at that point, it would have crumbled, and after that, your own wings could close onto the center as it was battling between the heavier elements, right? So again, here, there's nothing special about nor the French nor the English tactic, and more than else, this sounds like, it's not like Boucicaut really thought we have to move the entire wing around the English archers. You give too much to these English archers. They weren't really that special. They would have melted away had the French probably charged them frontally with all their complement, but it could have routed them even with less men, in fact, with a concealed party from the front and attacking them with a wing as well, from the flank, I mean, and attacking them frontally with a corresponding wing in the front. And the fact, by the way, that the position had woods on the flanks is naturally good. We've seen it in different instances, but we also have seen how, for example, Poitiers, like at Azincourt, the French vastly outpowered the English. All right, and the English fought the way they did, a bit enrocked also in this terrain, exactly because they were all on the defensive. These English armies of the 100 Years' War weren't anything particularly different from the French ones, right? And at this point, were in a terrible situation that they should have not found themselves in, and they were just out of desperation, because otherwise, if they had been favored, they would have fought in another way, right? And they managed to win because of leadership, of morale, of training, of organization, all the things that you should really attach to the greatness of the medieval English military culture, and that we reduce to the longbowman. Then is frankly like an insult, by the way, to the men-at-arms, to the entire system, to the longbowmen themselves, because they would have been proud of cooperating in a system rather than being some sort of battle winners. Nobody thought of them like in those terms. So it's again something that also the thing of bridging the gap, like coming as fast as possible. It's just not something that units are concerned with doing in the field, right? This is not machine guns firing. This is not something you have to hurry for. Heavy infantry can confidently dislodge those men from there, right? And even more heavy cavalry. Instance says, so sometimes dividing your forces, even if it's just splitting them in two or it's splitting them into a number of forces to attack the archers in a pincer movement, is a good way of dividing up the intensity of archery of the arrows, and meaning that more of the arrows just go into the ground and don't hit anything at all. So this, you see how he approached this. The idea is that if you split your own forces, these guys have a more difficult time to target you. Who did that? Which kind of unit split in open field to surround archers, has heavy troops as common infantry? Like nobody, I've never seen this anywhere, right? Again, one thing is a concealed sort of, 50, 60 horsemen that can fall on the flank of any formation, men-at-arms, same infantrymen, on the wings and so on and crush them. It's not even a pincer, it's a pincer movement if you consider these as, coming from two directions, but it's mostly like, a frontal attack and then something terribly asymmetrical based on surprise from the rear is psychologically devastating. So nobody would just break an infantry formation to outflank the army. It's insane. Like, so honestly, I've never even thought of anything like this, and I'm pretty sure that Boucicaut was not meaning to do any of this had those woods not been in the way. But even less, this has specifically to do with the gaps that you leave open to the archer, because if you open your formation, this is just a thing calibrated on individual ad personam kind of, even if in a group sense here, kind of idea where the arrow hits. They didn't care. All right, and you don't expose your flank either to the archers when you do these maneuvers. All right, that's not normally a thing. Like, if you're doing that maneuver, you do it from a longer distance. You don't do strange things here that are about testing whether more or less arrows hit or not. That's not how a military unit logically operates, right? They don't care. There is an intrinsic force in the heavy forces that can overwhelm the archers, all right? Then Easton says, what do you think? Do you think it's better to group together and advance quickly and smash into the middle of the archers? Do you think it's better to flank around? And why? The answer is nobody did that. Either way, right? That's not how battles were fought in practice, and that's not how even a flank attack was supposed to work. That was about pinning the enemy frontally. That normally with heavies, you could simply wipe the floor out of the longbowmen. And likely, again, the flank attacks, in this case, in the case of Agincourt, would have been, had it been possible because of the terrain space, targeting the flank of the entire formation. It wasn't about the archers, per se. It would maybe start with the archers, but the archers could also be dislodged frontally, right? And even if they surely killed people frontally, it's not like those people lost, but they arrived at the stakes. They fought there. So it's a bit of a different reality, and we understand that the archers weren't merely archers, right? They could fight. At that point, units had passed themselves, and they had been escorted by heavier infantrymen to heavy arms. They would have at that point not fought as archers. They would have fought as melee. All right, so this is not the thing. Like, and Easton says, I'd be interested to see down in the comments what your views are. It's very clear that both are supposed in this historical events. What does it mean? Are supported, not supposed. Okay, and how are they supported? By this evidence you provided, like the fact that Boucicaut wanted to attack the flanks. Well, attacking the flanks is something that you normally do, not just to attack like one wing. That has to do with having the entire formation collapse, and it's not fundamentally something that other armies did not do. Archers are not archers, and mostly they were targeting heavies on the flanks, right? So everybody did that. It wasn't about splitting forces. It could take like even a symbolic amount of troops to just fool the enemy if you manage to be unseen, to attack from the flank, and having that devastating psychological effect of outflanking. It was done in many battles. None of this had to do with particularly coping with war with archers of any kind, right? And at Agincourt, I honestly think that was also basically the same thing. And it's even just a hypothetical it could have been done, right? It's before he used the adjective potential. It was the potential statement, not even potential, tactical potential, something like that. So it's not a language I'm used to see in this kind of contexts. Easton says both were done historically for slightly different reasons, but again, here we haven't really explained. The video does not explain how that would be the case. And I think whether you have armor on, I think if you have armor on, it might be better to stay in one group in the middle. I think if you are more vulnerable, of course, like, okay, but the units already fought like that by default, all right? It says, I think if you are more vulnerable, like horses are a lot of horse flesh to hit with arrows, it's probably better to spread out to reduce the chances of being hit at all. Yes, a heavy cavalry charge, according to you, has to split, not to be hit by arrows. To realize that, light infantry doesn't hold terrain against heavy infantry or cavalry. And what happened in Agincourt is a very anomalous think not due to the magical changing of heavy and light function, but because the French were, and we have evidence of that, explicit evidence that says that they were radically understrength and probably taking it easy, also because they were actual archers. This is not to say it takes away the merit, but again, are we also just sure that those were only archers? Because Azincourt is one of those battles that, again, are very difficult to reconstruct, even just with the evidence at hand, right? And even if one source said something, it doesn't say, the other 70% of the context needed to make it really definitive. And again, I don't think we have evidence in practice that this was done by archers alone, nor that the point was to close in the gaps of or even a cavalry charge had to open the how? But seriously, how? What for? Right? It would have disrupted its potential, its capacity. You can't do that if you're, say, and this is also what makes me think that it was actually something more compact than archery, because, normally you can break a cavalry formation when you chase someone, but when you charge, if anyone is expected to resist, or even just archers, you just go smash into them. And it's not like if the cavalry charge had been compact, they were taking this high amount of losses for the charge to be done for. Otherwise, medieval armies would have just superiorly taken out everybody, cavalry, infantry, just with archers, or at least just cavalry would have not been prevalent, and definitely cavalry remained the superior arm even well throughout the entire 100 Years' War. And the infantry that emerged victorious for this were primarily the men-at-arms. We don't have evidence of archers as light infantry stopping cavalry charges. All right, and of course, if you say, 100 archers versus one guy, that's done. But by the scale of symmetrical convention of these armies, that didn't happen by definition. And I really care, because Azincourt becomes the paradigm of everything without even proving that any of, that the cavalry was stopped as a functional charge by the archers per se, right? When there was melee at some point at the stakes. It wasn't the longbows that did all the job as missile weapons. They ignored most of it, presumably. Archers at this point could even have swords and other weapons, so again, that's true, but that's not missile force anymore. And normally these troops were separated, were specialized, were distinct, right? Everything that moves away from that sounds too oddly suspicious, especially the larger the engagement really is. And Houston says, anyways, thanks a lot for watching. Of course, if you haven't watched, okay, so he talks about the replica again. So I'm intensely happy that, okay, because talking about the replicas tests and says, it has given me lots of ideas. It reinvigorated some of my thoughts about archery and armor and lots of other things. And indeed, it's reminded me of why English and French like to put the armor that they did, because they were the people facing massed longbow arrows. No, I don't think there is any evidence that they had more or better armor than other parts of Europe in particular. They were among the top, but in this sense equal more or less to, well, slightly inferior even to other places that used crossbows at large, including the same French, by the way, against one another. I mean, at Poitiers, they weren't just the English longbowmen, they were the Gascon crossbowmen. We tend not to sort of remember that they were even more than English. I mean, the Gascon contingent. So again, let's be proper, at least in the quantities, because the quantities alone could change the whole paradigm of comparison if it is intended as parity. The test is also, frankly, not quite impressive, because it all started from the assumption here that, again, this is a lot of arrows against heavily armored guys, and at a close range, by the way. Yes, some armor is penetrated, but then, like, do we have what happens with bigger armies? Do we have evidence of missile troops beating the heavy ones? No, right? And there is a reason. You get this from the diachronic and comparative study of the art of war, right? If this had been a regular evidence, we would talk about that. Is there a regular explicit evidence that the missile element beat the heavy one? No. That it could be the tip of the balance? If you decide it's the tip of the balance, because there are many other tips that form the two sides of the scale, so why is that more important? It's not more important. It's not 50% plus 1. It's not even probably close even to 10%, right? So considering all the odds. And this was pretty much it. And in the end, I ended up being more critical in any case, because that's how I see, when something, premises are always moderate. Then when things proceed on the basis of something that becomes ever more erratic in direction, like it really borders out of the sort of what I think it's the case and to be acceptable in this military historical sense. So making these videos, I think, is always very funny and interesting, because it shows you how many different ideas can pop up. This is not a very long video. I think it's less than half an hour. And a great part of it is also showing those replica tests that, again, barely have much to do with the topic. And as you understand here, the video began sort of going down some rabbit holes of essentially abstract nature. And when you have all the evidence that we have for medieval warfare, why does this have to be abstract? I really don't understand. So this video actually ended up being longer than the other two even, because really starting to comment on a lot of Schola Gladiatoria's work, and apparently this earns to us great views. But again, I don't do it mostly for that reason, because you always have to moderate the comments, because people began to come up with these pre-confection ideas that are always more or less wrong. Not talking Eastern here, I'm talking all the people who come saying, I'm autistic, and I think that, okay, so if you're autistic, it means you don't understand anything about, moral forces. Why are you even commenting? Oh, you think that everything is a replica test, that the reality works like that? It doesn't work like that. Like, reality is not controlled. Deal with it, all right? And you have, how do you cope with this? Like, you have at some point to say, this is not what we are seeing, not just in medieval warfare, but this is not what probably as a premise is valid, right? So this is lost. I made really 5 video responses over the years, just recently, 2 in 2018, 1 in 2021, and 2 in 2025. This is the 3rd one. And so, again, you understand my criticism. Like, if Schola Gladiatoria was to ever listen to me, like, I am competitively countering certain ideas because I think they are objectively wrong, right? They're historically inaccurate on the basis of battles, reconstruction, through accounts, through compare, not what the single source says, or how you can abstractly imagine a situation that on the battlefields did not normally even happen, because it was not. It's not like everything is unpredictable, but not in the way these armies normally fought. Things could go astray, but not in the sense that you can change the nature of heavy or light infantry, heavy or light troops in general. Like, the thing of closing the gap in particular seems, again, gratuitously strange in general. And there are actual examples telling the truth. I don't remember which battle. I had this flash right now that there are French troops that actually closed the gaps. And I talk about this. I don't remember. I made an entire video about this topic. There's explicit evidence of this in the it's titled English Tactics of the 100 Years' War, the French Countermeasures. And we're told, in fact, something possibly even had to do with the shields themselves. I don't want to remember wrongly, but the fact that this heavy equipped Frenchmen with those Pavises even basically gapped the bridge with the longbowmen without much of a problem, and the English fled, or something like that, Right now, I'm just vaguely remembering, paraphrasing. It was a video from April, but the quote is very famous, and I have to go fish it again. But I mean, it was done. All right, so which absolutely means that Longbowmen did inflict heavy losses on the enemy, but in ways that are probably to be measured historically on the basis of things like how many troops were there from the other side. If you don't even know that, because we normally don't, how can you even measure the strength ratios? And if we can't, why do we have to assume that it's something that is flipping the universal norm in all medieval warfare? Right? How likely is that? Right? This is the point I'm making. It's not like a contentiously strange point. It's really, I think, pretty obvious. Very well, however, I was glad to talk about this. I want always take the chance of thanking scholagladiatoria for all the works he does. He's an amazing creator. He's a great guy. I think he has some background in archaeology or something, and he knows his deal with apology. He has an antiquarian taste. He really knows a lot. I appreciate that he falls back on sources. He's a reliable guy. Especially, he's a very positive person that is able to take a lot of, not necessarily flack. Maybe my video here is, I don't know, I'm grateful for what it is, but I think this is the fun. Like, if you make videos like this, you're automatically exposed to criticism. This is valid for myself as well. But let's say I like to discuss this stuff because I think that if you understand how medieval armies actually fought, you can understand so much about all the rest of our civilization. So I take it very much at heart, and I hope not to come off as arrogant or rude. I know that sometimes I'm very sort of not verbally aggressive, but say my attitude is like, oh, this is not the case, this is not true. Like, but articulating it, I think, is what matters at that point. So to me, if something is no, it's no, right? Regardless of who says that. So I absolutely respect and, again, thank very much Matt Easton for all his great work. And I really admire him also as a YouTuber. I mean, I obviously don't have the success that he has. But I'm not even making these videos just for the sake of views. I'm not getting many of them anyway. But it's just to sensitize people a little bit more on these topics, because, you see, if Easton is... as I see here, it's like the only person who more or less talks about this stuff in any analytical sense. I think if we add voices to that, we can really obtain a big deal of results. We can talk more and more about medieval warfare, and we can definitely find out lots of new sort of aspects to explore. We can get to know sort of different things, different references, and I think that's really what matters in this environment, so to say. And so again, I thank anyone who was contributing also in that sense. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.